3. Hasn't that gone fast? And we're up to our second type of learning. So last week we did, the last 2 weeks we've done classical conditioning, and we're about to start operant conditioning when my PowerPoint decides to work. Okay, so trial and error learning was the first concept that Thorndike actually investigated before the concept of operant conditioning came up. And basically Thorndike placed a hungry cat in a box. And it was called a puzzle box because it wasn't obvious how to get out of this box. Placed some food outside, and basically through trial and error, the cat eventually got out of the box. So it tried a few different things, accidentally came across the successful skills necessary to get out of the box. And as it was rewarded with food, once it actually exited the box, it became quicker and quicker at eliminating these unsuccessful attempts and making it out of the box. So a pretty basic experiment. And the way I try to remember is Thorndike and his cats. And you'll see in a couple of slides you'll learn about Skinner and his rats. So Thorndike was the man who did the experiment with the cats. Okay, so from this he came up with the law of effect, which is basically the idea that if any behaviour is followed by something good, it would be strengthened. So you're more likely to repeat that behaviour and more often. Whereas a behaviour that's followed by something that's not so nice tends to be reduced. We don't tend to repeat this behaviour. He also came up with the law of exercise, which basically says that the more that you strengthen this connection between the behaviour and the consequence, the stronger the learning becomes. And basically he came up with the idea that most of our behaviours, or a lot of our behaviours, are based on these laws. So the consequences we get after the behaviour and how often we get these consequences. Skinner also completed some experiments, and he did it on rats and pigeons. I tend to just remember Thorndike and his cats and Skinner and his rats. And he's the one that actually developed the term operant conditioning. So basically operant conditioning is when behaviour is determined by its consequences. And the organism learns to operate on their own environment, hence the word operant. You learn to operate on your environment. So if you do something and you get a good consequence, you'll do it again. If you do something and you don't get a good consequence, then you probably won't repeat it. So you learn to manipulate your environment. The operant is the organism's response that occurs. And this behaviour is usually voluntary, which we'll talk about in terms of classical conditioning shortly. Okay, you need to know the discriminative stimulus, the behaviour and the consequence in any scenario when we're talking about operant conditioning. So for instance, when you come up with a scenario like, basically we're starting a new topic of learning, that would be the discriminative stimulus, which is almost like D for discriminative stimulus, D for the description of the environment. So it's the environment, the conditions that the person's in. So you come into class and we're starting a new topic of learning. You then have a choice of how you behave when I do that topic. So you can decide to sit and listen and complete the work, or you could decide, which I hope you don't, to not listen and not complete the work. And when you decide on your behaviour, there will be consequences that will hopefully determine whether that behaviour is repeated. So in the good circumstance, hopefully you did choose to listen, you completed the work, you get a good SAC score, therefore you gain some praise, a good feeling, you're pretty happy with yourself, and you're more likely to do the same next time you come into psychology. Perhaps if you chose the other option and you didn't behave, consequences might have been me annoying you, constantly telling you off, also perhaps not doing well in your assessment, and then hopefully the behaviour of you not listening and not completing your work will be reduced. So we'll do a couple of examples of this in class, but you should be able to outline the discriminative stimulus, the behaviour and the consequence in any scenario. Okay, so Skinner, like I said, was also a key researcher here in operant conditioning, and he came up with the Skinner box, and we'll do some activities around this in class and watch some videos. But basically the box had a light in it, it had a lever in it, it had the means of providing food as a reward, but also an electric shock through the floor, and it also had a means of recording the responses made. So basically we could look at what behaviours the rat would emit we would reward or punish accordingly, and then we'll measure to see what change in behaviour we see in that rat. And a lot of what we talk about in operant conditioning has been based on experiments like this. Okay, operant conditioning is slightly different to classical conditioning, but it's also got some similarities. So extinction, stimulus, generalisation, discrimination and spontaneous recovery actually occur in both. So you will need to know examples of this in terms of operant conditioning. And I'll talk about that in class in more detail. At this stage, you just need to know that it's common to both classical and operant conditioning. The differences are that in classical conditioning, the learner is passive, which means they actually don't have to do anything. Pavlov's dog just sat there, didn't have to do anything. In operant conditioning, it requires the learner to be very active. So you actually have to come into class and decide whether to listen or not listen before then a consequence is given. So very different types of behaviours. The other thing is, the last dot point, classical conditioning, we know the response is reflexive, for example, salivation in Pavlov's dog, but in operant conditioning, the response is voluntary. You choose whether you want to show a certain behaviour. The second last dot point there, in classical conditioning, the bell on the food always was presented before the organism reacted. So the stimulus comes first, followed by the response, which was salivation. In operant conditioning, it's the other way around. The person's response actually comes first, and then the consequence or the stimulus comes afterwards. So that's kind of a confusing concept to get your head around, but it requires the animal to do something first, whereas in classical conditioning, something happens first and then the animal responds. So slightly different from classical conditioning. Okay, so things that you need to know about operant conditioning is that it involves both reinforcement and punishment. You'll see the next slide talks about punishment. With reinforcement, there are two different types of reinforcements. So these are things that can happen after a behaviour. So you can behave in a certain way, and for instance, doing your household chores, and your parents can decide to give you pocket money as a reward for doing this. Now, the positive part of this positive reinforcement is the addition of something pleasurable. So you're getting money added to your pocket. And the arrow leading upwards is about the fact that this would then increase your behaviour. Both types of reinforcement, whether it's positive or negative, will increase your behaviour. Negative reinforcement is a little harder to identify because it's about taking away an unpleasant stimulus, and this then leads to an increase in the likelihood of a behaviour being repeated. So the example I've got there is, for instance, you're walking down the street, it's raining, you put an umbrella up. That takes away the unpleasant stimulus of getting wet, so therefore when it rains again, you're more likely to do this again. Okay. Another example would be, for instance, if a child's crying, you might give it a dummy, and you are being negatively reinforced. So therefore, you're removing the unpleasant stimulus, which is the crying. Therefore, you're more likely to give the child a dummy every time it cries. The child's actually being positively reinforced. They're gaining something out of the situation. We'll go through a whole heap of these scenarios in class to really make sure that you understand the difference between these two. Both of them lead to an increase in the likelihood of the behaviour being repeated. Ignore that heading. It says elements of classical conditioning. It should actually say elements of operant conditioning. So apologies for that. So punishment is something that again is added, but this time it leads to a decrease in the particular behaviour occurring again. So for instance, I went through a red light not so long ago, didn't actually realise, but I had the addition of a red light camera fine, which was $360 added to me, and I can tell you now that every time the light is orange, I brake and do not attempt to go through that light. So something's been added to the situation, and it's definitely decreased my likelihood of repeating that behaviour. Response cost is when, also sometimes called negative punishment, is when something's taken away from the situation that leads to a decrease in the behaviour. So usually the thing that's taken away is something desirable. So for instance, you're talking in class and you get your mobile phone taken away, and what we're trying to do is reduce the talking in class. and this is what makes it response cost. Okay, so punishment is often used, but it's not actually a great way to change behaviour. And the reason is because it actually has some interesting side effects or consequences. So normally, if you've been punished for something, what that tends to do is make you feel really quite angry and frustrated. You may have feelings of helplessness if you're continually punished, and you may have anger or aggression towards the punisher. The other thing is quite often punishment is about frustration for the person who's doing the punishing. So for instance, you might find that your parents yell at you and it's more about releasing that frustration than it is about that being an appropriate consequence for your actions. The other thing is it doesn't provide an alternative suitable behaviour. So if you, for instance, do get punished for something, so for instance, you tell a kid off for playing, a baby off for playing with something, but you just tell them off, that's not actually telling them what they should be doing. If you are going to give punishment, it should definitely be brief. It should occur immediately after the consequence, not a couple of weeks later or 6 months down the track, unfortunately like our court system. And it should be linked directly to the bad behaviour. So you should be punishing the behaviour, not the person. So sometimes it can be effective, but it's not brilliant. Okay, when you're giving either punishment or reinforcement, you can give it on different schedules, and schedules means the frequency and manner in which these consequences are given. So sometimes you can continually reinforce someone, which means you reinforce every single time that they show the behaviour, or perhaps punish every single time. Or things can be partially reinforced when you only give the consequence sometimes, not all times. So for instance, you might find that your teachers only mark key pieces of work rather than every piece of work that you do. So that will be partial reinforcement. Okay, of partial reinforcement, there are 4 different ways of doing that. Fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval, and vario ratio. These are really difficult concepts, so I'm actually not going to explain these in the video. What I want you to do is just literally get the notes down, and we'll go through a whole heap of examples in class to really make sure that you understand this. So just make sure you pause and get those notes down. Try to understand it where possible, but don't stress too much if you don't. Okay, so other things, like I said, about operant conditioning, extinction occurs. So this is when the conditioned response disappears due to no reinforcement. So for instance, let's say you got grounded because you were late, but then you're late 5 more times and you don't get grounded, well then you'll continue being late. So maybe you learnt once not to be late, but now all of a sudden that learnt response has gone. Out of the blue, it might just reappear after a period of extinction. So out of the blue, you look at your clock, you think, oh, I'm going to be late, and you actually go home on time. Stimulus generalisation might be when your parents ground you for being late, so then all of a sudden you think you're going to get in trouble at school as well, so you start being on time everywhere. Stimulus discrimination might be you're only late perhaps if mum's home or dad's home, or maybe you're only late to certain classes because you know your teacher will or won't give you consequences for those actions. Okay, operant conditioning is used in a couple of circumstances. It's used in shaping. Basically, shaping is the idea of rewarding successive approximations or responses that get closer to a desired response. So for instance, if you want to teach your dog to sit, drop down and then roll over, originally you would reinforce them every time they sit, but then once they've got that desired response, you would only reinforce them once they sit and drop down. And then once they've got that response, you would only reinforce them once they sat, dropped down and rolled over. So quite often used in animal training. Token economies are often used in prisons, sometimes in schools as well, and basically tokens are given for good behaviour or the desired behaviour that we want, and these tokens can be exchanged for something that the person deems to be valuable. So instead of giving someone praise when they might not care what their teachers want, if you gave them tokens, perhaps once they get 10 tokens, they get some free food at the canteen and they can pick what food they want. That might be really appropriate reinforcement. So it's good in that the person who's giving the consequence doesn't have to guess what's appropriate. The person who's getting the consequence gets to choose how they're rewarded. Okay, so that's it for this PowerPoint. There is a second one for this week, and that'll go up shortly and is much shorter. We've only got just over a week and a half until the next SAC. So if you can get that one done ASAP, that would be wonderful. I'll see you in the next video.